Oh Brother We're Out There, which is a comedic romp through, we go to a very other than that, right? And it's not that there weren't comedic elements to this, but it was one of those, how do we show the dark side of who we are and how do we understand that? This is a Silence of the Lambs type of movie. How do we understand the difficulty of life? So in the midst of all that, where do you find God is the question, right? And it's hard, isn't it?
Well, ultimately, law and order prevails, so maybe that's where we find God in that faith.
Yeah, that we have an ability to not let that be the final word. I think I'm stuck again.
Machine in the sense of the underlying theme is that technology is going to defeat the forces of lawlessness, with radio detection and spectrographs, and it's the post-war world and science is king, and Cody Jarrett and his gang are these relics from the 30s and indeed from the Wild West, just running around. And it'd be interesting to see what the slant of the author of the story would be now, 70 years on, or at least 60, well, almost, when our greatest fear is the abuse of science.
Yeah.
In terms of the jeopardy it poses. The mad dog criminal isn't perceived so much as the threat as the NSA, listening to everything you hear, monitoring every conversation, closed circuit televisions, etc. That seems to be.
There's a huge fear that direction, isn't there? Yeah.
Interesting what you're saying, Randy, though, because when the cloud of flame exploded, it seemed like the movie makers were alluding to Hiroshima, and in an approving way.
Yeah. That was the great atomic fire that was going to purge us of evil.
But part of the challenge is that we'd always love to just have simple solutions, wouldn't we?
And she's wanting to hang on to my arm now.
So sorry about that. I just got a message that my internet connection is unstable. So if I feel unstable today, don't listen to what I'm saying. All right. The hard part is that we all know there's things to be wary of in world, right? The question is what? And what solves some of that wariness? How many know you should be a little bit wary of some church things, right? But how to be wary of what is important there isn't. Sometimes we get what we are scared of mixed up, and our fears go over the top. And Cody Jarrett is a really good example. What caused who he was? And was what we were doing, was that helping or hurting that? The authorities, the technology, was it solving the issue or perpetuating an issue?
Clearly one of the themes, and certainly I, from my work, encountered it, is the paradox of our sending you know, to, you know, share information and engage in, you know, destructive mutations. You know, it's just, it's kind of crazy, but it persists.
And why do you think, Randy, that our ability to be destructive is so persistent?
Well, I think that you know, I'm not quite as Freudian as this movie suggests,
Uh-huh.
but that humans are. But I think that we are only part way on our journey from our animal origins to hopefully a more enlightened state of existence. But we all still harbor all of those negative emotions in our unconscious and subconscious, and a lot of what becoming a human being is learning to suppress those and, you know, appeal to the better angels of our nature.
Yeah.
And we're just kind of slowly moving along, but, you know, as I don't, you know, recorded history suggests we haven't made that much progress. We made more progress in terms of living hope.
This is an obvious thing to say, but I have to say it. I'm still in shock from the election that after seeing so much destruction and spiritual violence, so 70 million Americans still voted to perpetuate that.
Yeah.
It's stunning.
It's stunning is right. And our ability to hold on to that message of that feels so different to me. Like, you know, yesterday, my friend Dean, that I've told you about a lot, posted this thing and said, look, in North Carolina, the Democrat conceded to the Republican. And I wrote back, well, imagine that, conceding a race that is lost. And he didn't get the joke.
Oh, goodness.
Of course, the irony there is, you know, I'm absolutely certain Cal Cunningham would have won that race. Tillis was that disliked in North Carolina, but for his surrendering to one of those baser instincts.
Yeah.
Lust, you know.
Yeah.
And what amazes me is that, you know, the good citizens of North Dakota were appalled by his infidelity, but apparently are more than willing to tolerate Donald Trump's serial infidelities.
But much of that, Randy, is what message we choose to listen to. Okay. And so on one side, they're hearing their very religious side says infidelity, sexual misconduct is wrong. On the other side, they're saying something that appears to be savior of mankind or some approximation of that, that allows them to hear this story very differently than this story.
Jim, say that again, because you locked up for a minute. You said on one side this, and then you said on one side that, and it locked.
So on one side, it's the sexual immorality question, but on the other side, it's the savior of mankind. This somehow following God's plan type of idea. And the reality is that those stories that we tell rarely have as much truth as what we think they do, or have a complete hold on the truth. But the more we tell them, the more we think they have complete truth. Right? So why are they telling certain stories about Donald Trump? Or why do we tell certain stories about any of our politicians and not the other ones, because the other side here knows the other story.
I just finished reading John Dean's book, Authoritarian Nightmare, which he co-wrote with a social scientist who's been studying authoritarianism for 20 some years. And what primarily seems to drive authoritarians is fear. And, this movie is really all about things to fear.
Yes. But can we allow ourselves to see that story or not is the question. Jarrett, bottom line was, at least part of his stuff was unresolved family issues.
Say more about that.
So those unresolved family issues that he had, whatever was going, I mean, he lost brother early, he lost dad early. And so he had this devotion to mom, this Oedipal complex type of thing. And somehow that was not being resolved at all for him. And maybe it was unresolvable at this point, but there's no doubt that some of that was what was driving him. So the hard part is we often don't know what it is that's driving. Who knows what it is that needs to be fulfilled in Donald Trump? But just defeating him doesn't really resolve that issue. Just blowing up the refinery doesn't solve Cody Jarrett. It just puts an end to it. How do we get to those deeper psychological issues in the midst of everything else?
I was walking with a friend this morning, and we were talking about just how difficult it is to hear this skewed, what we think of as sort of a skewed worldview that so many people hold right now. And I was reminded, when I was younger, I worked as a volunteer on a crisis line.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were kind of the off-hour support for people who were suffering from really serious mental illness, schizophrenia. And we were trained that when someone called, they were kind of enter into what they were dealing with, someone who is paranoid, someone is trying to get into your apartment to poison you. I'm sorry that's happening. Why don't you go close your window? Or, kind of like somehow entering into how they were seeing things. And I was telling my friend Carol, it's like, I kind of feel like that's called for in this situation too, where people are so consumed by these fears that just kind of reasoning with them is not working. It's kind of like you have to take an extra step of
meeting them where they are.
Yeah, meeting them in their insanity. Meeting them. Yeah.
But that point of meeting them in their insanity is part of the difficulty. It means we have to go to an ugly space, and all of us have a certain amount of cringing from that. Right? Why would I want to go into that space which is causing dysfunction in you? And yet that's exactly what we need to do in a very real way.
Yes, because we're essentially in a locked room with that person or those people, and there's 75 million Americans who have one point of view and 70 million that have another, and they're not going, neither faction is going to disappear.
Right. No matter how much both of us would like the other two.
may be the only way forward. And I suspect if I get it in and get it published, I'll just end up getting hated by both factions, including members of the one I belong to, because I suggest the only thing we can do is to try and identify which one of our sacred cows we are prepared to sacrifice as a gesture to show we are willing to acknowledge the legitimacy at some level of the perspective of the other side. And as a good faith gesture, quid pro quo, to say, I'm willing to give this up if you'll give that up. And when you make a list of those things, you realize how difficult it's going to be for people on both sides, even if they want to do it.
Yeah.
You know,
But
I've
that's
told-
but that's the nature of chaos. Is it makes us have to consider things that we haven't considered before. And can I let go of? Or is this neatly ordered something such a sacred cow that I don't know how to let go of it?
But I think that if we have a real conversation with someone who's different from what we are, I have a cousin, Scott has cousins, we'll see that we're not all that far apart. I mean, I learned some of this working with the church, lobbying for but when I looked at what they thought were gay people, it was not the same picture that I had. And I realized that it's just people don't know. They see a propaganda film, or they read a book, or they listen to a sermon, and they think, this is one real example. All gay men go out and to bars every night and have sex with 3 or 4 different people and look for young boys. And, you know, that's not what my experience has been, obviously, and probably not any of yours. I mean, there's probably a couple that I knew that were like that, but as somebody thinks that's what's happening, and I don't want my grandson to be like that. Well, yeah, I wouldn't want my grandson to be like that either, but it's such, you know, there's so much education and experience that people need. And I can't hate people who grew up in a small town in South Dakota and that's all they know. Yeah. And I don't know how to bring more education to them, although we have tried, but I think that's a big part of it, is that they just don't have the experience that the rest of us have had.
And I think another thing that gets in the way, and Randy, you kind of alluded to this earlier, is that idea of survival of the fittest, that we have to have that which we're against. And there's no doubt that right now there's a whole lot of where we think we have to fight against the worst of what I think you are, rather than try to find what I hear you saying is that we have to find why we're in connection with each other.
I think that's why talk radio, especially where my daughter Kristen is in Montana, it's just all things that she is against. And it's just not based on fact at all. It's just one rhetoric after another. And if people listen to that, that's what they think is true.
Right.
I think it's been so exciting to see Pete Buttigieg, his pieces on Fox. I don't know if any of you have watched any of that, but he's been invited to talk. And a friend was just sharing with us, he talked recently about late-term abortion, and he just talked about the reality of the numbers of that, and said, you know, think about what that would mean. You know, this would be a woman who had not intended to abort her child. This would be, maybe she picked out a name, maybe she had the crib, and then some horrible medical diagnosis. You know, he was like educating them. Not that I mean, that's a controversial issue, late-term abortion, but I'm saying that he was educating them about the cases where that would be a medical necessity in a way that was so human. I mean, I just really admired how straightforward he was and how he was just educating folks to hear this, this perspective.
So it's not just the easy moral, look, they're killing babies.
Exactly.
Right.
He fused the emotional.
Yeah.
It was beautifully done. And he has this opportunity. You know, they keep inviting him back to be this really civil voice of more liberal thinking on Fox News. It's wonderful.
Yeah. And how do we start doing that? Because the reality is, okay, so in the middle of that, my connection froze you for a second, Sharon, and this is what you looked like. Something like that, right? And I think that that's how we view each other, is in that kind of confrontational space. And that's not what you were doing. That was a small illustration in the midst of everything else that was going on. But we freeze each other that way, don't we?
I was watching an instructional video on YouTube a day or two ago about genomics, the human gene system. And they said that all human beings, every one of us, have 99.99% identical genetic makeup, and that all of our differences are 0.001%. Not quite sure what to do with that, but a lot of people say we're more alike than different, and that sounds trivial, but the science says in spades that's true.
Well, and when it comes to survival of the fittest, that we understand some of that. We see that the fast leopard catches the slow lamb, right? Whatever it is. But the reality is much of the definition of how we've survived, both in the animal kingdom and in the world of human beings, is that because we've figured out ways to group together, to help each other, to not just be an individual fighting against being the slowest or the most crippled. And that story too of community has to be set next to the survival of the fittest somehow. And Cody Jarrett had absolutely nothing of community around him. The only approximation he had was he gathered this group of people who would somehow work towards a particular means, getting this amount of money. But he didn't have anybody who he could truly call community, did he?
Just his mom.
I'm not even, you're right that he had her, but I'm not even certain that he could call that community, because I'm not sure they had a really good relationship either.
I was going to say that I think the folks have bookended the problem with breaking down this barrier of communication and interrelation. What Sharon has said, is what I have experienced to be the way that human beings choose to look at the world. Anecdotally, they want to see, tell me a story about a person, and then we generalize from that for good or for ill. As Ms. Morris has said, you you get a bad example, and unfortunately, people will generalize from that. And and this is our greatest challenge, is that we've got to stop, or at least be very conscious of, when we are using instances, anecdotes, individuals as the basis for our making decisions at the macro level.
Mm-hmm.
And that's real tough for us, because as Americans, we believe in, we're individuals, we're unique. And as Christians, that's, I have a unique soul that will last forever, and it's just against our, in many ways, we have to struggle against our nature to say, let's look at this in terms of the numbers, in terms of the science, in terms of, not the emotionally laden story,
Yeah.
but the brutally black and white statistics, and again, it's easier to pose the problem than it is to solve it, but that's the way I see it.
The hard part is, like, I just got a notice as I'm sitting here that Dean replied to my comment. I automatically wanted to go there and fight with him again, right? Because who knows what he said to me. And it's really easy to see somebody like that from the worst of who they are. And I know that's not true. Just as I know that the worst of what I know about any one of you is not the true picture of you. So how do we step into that much more complicated relationship than the very simple stereotype? Especially if the Cody Jarrett in our life is continually playing off of that stereotype and being the most violent, evil type of person possible. How do you, like Doris asked us, how do you step into the relationship?
I think I think there has to be an element of faith, because when we look at all these differences, it can be overwhelming and disheartening. But the intention, which sounds like, Randy, you have in trying to grapple with your letter to the editor, the intention is to find healing and common ground and restore community. And I think we just have to have that intention, even if we're overwhelmed by the reality of what's around us.
I just wish, see, I know that before all this COVID started, and after Donald Trump got elected, before the COVID started, I started consciously attending this breakfast group with a group of men who I knew almost to a man were Donald Trump supporters, because I had to find out what they were thinking, for the reason I what's going through the minds of these people. The curious thing is that I think I've been accepted. I know I've been accepted by these men, and they like me well enough, and they sort of regard my political views as sort of like a developmental disability. It's not, it's probably not really his fault, but etc. And again, I think it may only be possible to overcome this on a relationship by relationship, individual by individual basis. But
Yeah.
good God, that's going to take a long time.
But especially, Randy, if, as you postulated way near the beginning, these folks are only listening to certain strands, and that we're not in any kind of connection to them. Right? I look in some of the places where I deal with some of my relatives who are all of that same nature. They only listen to each other rather than the larger story. And maybe I do too. If I just sit at St. Francis, I get a really good story. But is it the whole of the story?
One of the things that I found helpful when being in a group like you were talking about, Randy, I used to work and the thing that I found was helpful to say, because it never worked to try to contradict what somebody else was saying, but I found the phrase, "That's not been my experience," or "I have friends who are fill in the blank, immigrants, gay." So sometimes people would want to hear more and sometimes not. But I remember one time our receptionist was particularly bad-mouthed in the derogatory terms she used for some of the people who passed through our office. And she said something one day in my presence about, I don't know which group she used the derogatory term for. And then she just kind of stopped and she said, "Oh, sorry, I forgot you have friends like that." And so you know, I took that as a step forward, you know.
But at least part of that is she realized that her experience wasn't universal.
Yeah.
And I think that universalizing of a small strand, we all do to some extent. Of course, everyone has my experience because mine's the perfect one.
Yeah.
It's hard for us not to.
Going back to the movie, you know, it's curious just how stark. I mean, other than Cody Jarrett's mother, in his circle, which we saw a lot of, it didn't seem like there was one thing. And goodness seemed to be the police who were trying to track him down. Just kind of wonder where that came from. That storytelling, it was so black and white. You know?
Well, I was thinking about that, just the whole genre of film noir, you know, those years when that became popular. I mean, it is, I find them really artsy and interesting to watch, but as a person that's given to angst and, you know, a little depression, it's like sometimes they're too much. It's like, I think, what was the appeal of that style in those years? Why did that rise up as this genre that, you know, there were a lot of movies made like that were kind of what you're saying, Hen, just that kind of starkness about human relationship where, you know, the men and the women are tough in their relationships with each other, and there's just not a lot of warmth, you know.
My own experience is that we tend to look back on the immediate post-war World War II era. We see the scenes of, you know, celebration on VE Day. We see the scenes of returning veterans, you know, kissing their sweethearts and wives. And then we, you know, sort of skip ahead to the 50s where everything was bucolic and wonderful. But the reality, I think, was that the Second World War had exposed an entire generation of young men to not just what's best and they saw it. They knew the world was not, all brightness and light, and that people were capable of monstrous, evil. But I think the point that was made initially, that in the end, goodness prevailed. I always tell my wife, who doesn't enjoy watching film noir too, I said, they all have a moral resonance. None of them end with the bad guys prevailing, if for no other reason than I think the movie code prohibited it. But even people that you're very sympathetic for, I'm thinking of a couple movies, Fred MacMurray in Double Indemnity or Robert Mitchum in Out of the Past. They seem to be decent guys caught up in a web, but they end up getting killed at the end. I mean, no question about it. They did the crime and they suffer the consequence, and I think, that's the reality we got. It wasn't all sweetness and light after the Second World War.
Well, and I think that's why theologies of hell develop, is because we all know people we need to place there, right? And so it's a simple theology to have, but it makes it, if we apply it, the generality down to the specific, and we assign Randy to hell, it's a whole different thing than that ultimately good will win at the expense of evil. You know what I'm saying?
I think that this movie one thing, the two Buddhist thoughts that am trying to draw on and understand, and trying to think of people that I so disagree with, are everyone wants to be happy. Everyone wants to be free from suffering. That's the truth that Buddha said. Mm-hmm. And so if you recognize that, you recognize that everyone's motivation springs from that, but that they can be in error and ignorance about how to do that correctly. But the other one is that the causes and conditions that come into someone's life are how they turn, what the result of that given those same causes and conditions in our lives, who's to say, we cannot have the arrogance that we would not have behaved the same way. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh tells this stunning story that I may have shared in this group about some pirates who were taking refugees across the ocean, and one of them assaults a young girl, and she's so distraught that she jumps into the ocean and drowns. And he says, whenever that story is told, everyone can empathize and feel sorrow for that child. And he says, I could be that pirate. He said, you have to think about, the causes and conditions that create that person. So, I felt like, I felt sorry for Jarrett, which is this character.
Cody.
Yeah, his headaches, and when the guy is rubbing his neck like his mother. I mean, that was kind of poignant, like he obviously is this needy guy. So it's like, if you can kind of take your mind there, it's so easy to think that you would never out of whatever. Who knows? Who's to say that you wouldn't be a Trump supporter?
Who says? Yeah.
I don't know. It's challenging, but
It's challenging.
Yeah.
And the last line in the movie is very haunting to me, especially right after the scene that it described, which is the most dramatic. Cody Jarrett on top of the oil tank, fire shooting up around him, saying, "Look, Mom, top of the world." And then the afterthought was Cody Jarrett finally got to the top of the world and it blew right up in his face, right? So he's searching for something that we know is completely outside of what is truly important in the world, but he achieves it and it blows right up in his face. And how do we help each other in those things where we are searching for something that's going to blow up in our face? What do we do with the headaches that are causing us to do that? And how do we help each other in the midst of those headaches? How do we deal with the death that he had to deal with? You know, nobody helped him deal with his mom's passing, right? And that obviously affected him deeply, caused him to break out of prison. How are we in those spaces with each other? Especially because Cody Jarrett's always going to push you away.
Neat. I found with my little bully cat, I'm taking it down to my level. My little bully cat, if I distract him, then he does a different behavior. And I've noticed way back when I was teaching that if I had some kids that were picking on or doing behavior I didn't like, I would distract them, and that would help.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking also about Trump. If he could be distracted somehow to be less bullying, could he be built up with a new venture or something? But it'll have to come down the road. But right now he's so raw and he's so hurting that I don't think he can listen. But the distraction is a thing I think might work. This is what my daughter is with her husband, who is so distraught over Trump losing. But she distracts him with different things, and it's working. So, that's all.
I agree with you, Sandy. I look at some of my Trump friends and for me, it feels like they're focused on something that may be a hurt, but it's not as important as other hurts. Maybe a story, but it's not as true as other stories. But how do I take them away from that fascination with this particular story?
Mhm. Yeah.
How do we get to other spaces with each other? And I've been reminded several times in different conversations, well, it seems like you're always here to just critique, not to be in relationship. And they don't quite say it that way, but that's the way I take it. And I think it's a fair representation. Am I just critiquing my opponents, or am I truly in relationship with them? I do believe that relationship ultimately is what solves most human problems. But it's one of the hardest things to do. And this movie proved it again and again with Cody Jarrett. There was no easy relationship with him. He'd been taught not to do that, that was the wrong course of action, to be in relationship. Right?
I'm thinking of that old saying that we've all heard. It's so simplistic: hate the sin, love the sinner. And it just seems so trite, but in this whole context, it seems. Question is, how do you do it? You know, when people are engaged in supporting things that are so abhorrent to us, how do we love them while not approving?
Right. Because as they continue to hurt, it gives us even more reason to run away from.
Yeah.
Just like Cody with his wife, you know, he didn't have a good relationship with her anyway. And when she killed Ma, he had even more reason to hate not just her, but the world.
Do you remember the scene where the steam engine blew up and hurt the man?
Mhm.
That's where I saw empathy. And maybe that's where I saw where God was, because the men didn't want to leave the wounded. They looked at him and said, oh, we've got to bring him. And that little piece, even though Cody did not like it, they did it anyway.
Yeah.
It was good.
And that's hard to do because, like, Cody was the one, you bought a gas truck, why didn't you just steal it? You know, he saw it a certain way very easily and didn't easily see courses beyond his framework.
Yeah, but I could relate to him when he said that because it showed he's a frugal person.
There you go.
Did you notice the music? It was just like a steam train. At first, it started out just with the pounding, and it got faster and faster and more dramatic and more dramatic. And at the end, it was screaming at us.
Yeah.
And that's mainly why I never went to those movies, because I'm so sensitive to music and sound.
Yeah.
I almost had to mute this when we were looking at it because it was, but it was so important to the movie.
Yeah. And the hard part is that the music is often something that is there and absolutely affecting us, but we don't recognize that it's the music that's doing that. So thank you for pointing that out, Sandy, because it does a lot of deep work on us.
Randy was sharing the context for the time that this movie was made. And the other thing that was going on, and I don't know the details, but the whole communist, immediately from World War II became this Cold War and this foreboding, ominous communist world of atheist, brutal dictators. Has fed a lot of fear in American life in the past.
I've suggested it in an earlier discussion, but historically, the only thing that can, has really proven to be able to dramatically bridge incredible ideological chasms is a common enemy. Winston Churchill said when, Hitler attacked Russia, he said, I'd be an ally. I don't know that I'd be an ally with the devil, but I'd certainly mention him favorably in a speech in Parliament. But I hate to think that that's the only way we can lay aside our differences.
Well,
if we perceive a mutual existential threat.
and here's the difficulty, Randy. Okay, so I think I've told some of you this before, but I think we're at this space in history. Throughout the history of humankind, we've defined the me in differing ways, always in enlarging ways. At first, it was just me against the whole world, but then I found the family clan that kind of helped protect me. And as we developed as human beings, it was the city against the other city, the state against the other state. Now we're at a space where we're at the largest possible definition of me, except for if we can define ourselves as one human world. But against what? We've always defined me against And I can we make this evolutionary jump to being able to define not against? Can we define ourselves in some other way?
The challenge is, I mean, psychology research has shown that human beings respond to threat and avoiding a negative far more powerfully than we are attracted to a good. That just, a lot of research shows that to be the case, and it's unfortunate. I don't know how what you're saying, Jim, directly touches that reality, but I don't know how to do it.
Well, because there's no simple way to be able to do it. Right? It's asking us to be something we've never really been. But something that right now the world necessitates. And I think that part of the American experience is that we try to say we can be on different sides and still be united. And at this point, part of what we're saying is that true? Or do I have to choose a side in order to be the United States? And I don't think we have to be. We just have to figure out how to live out the best of us, the best of what our ideal is.
I believe the biggest impediment to achieving that world vision, and I mean, basically, the problem is one of scarcity. And human beings, are, well, like, I've always said there's only one problem in the world. Every other problem is just a coincident to this, or a consequence of this problem. Too many people. Too many people. I mean, it took all of human history up till about the year 1900 to get 2 billion people. By 1960, it was 3 billion people. By 1999, it was 6 billion people. And we are not in a position to suggest some alternative to the rest of the world. They aspire to our standard of life, and understandably so, but it cannot happen. It cannot happen. As a practical matter, we got 5% of the world's population. We use 40% of the world's goods. The math just won't support it. And the only thing that seems to reduce the human proclivity for reproducing is a higher material standard of living. So it becomes kind of a race between how fast are we going to tap out the world's material versus
Yeah.
it's this. We are not going to achieve a world vision or identity, a sense of commonality based on the standard of material life that we in America enjoy. It would be wonderful if we could.
The hard part about what you're saying, though, is it means I have to admit that I'm the evil.
Yeah.
And I much rather make you that evil. It's much simpler, isn't it?
I think I said at some previous game, the biggest tragedy that ever occurs is the birth of a male American boy, because he's going to grow up and consume like hell,
Yeah.
I want to mention that when I hear that it resonates powerfully. At the same time, Jim, when you're saying, how do we get people galvanized by a common good rather than a common enemy or fear? One thing I think of is, and I know we've all seen these kinds of findings and statements, that human happiness doesn't seem to increase at a level of income. The number that I've heard is $86,000 a year. Once you have 86,000, whenever that was true in American life, no additional amount of money really significantly enhances well-being. And yet, being among the 5 wealthiest people on the planet, they still want something more, and they devoted their wealth to creating this hyper conservative. It's not that they really need, more. They just in their minds think they don't have enough. And a lot of the wealthiest Americans have enough, but don't think they do, or something. I don't know.
That sense of enough, Greg, is an important question.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we define it in material ways and also in spiritual ways is the real challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Because we often think more material is going to give me more spiritual. And that rarely has correlation. But much of the film noir is an exploration of that particular point. People going after that which will not give ultimate satisfaction. But our next movie is not dissimilar, but in a whole different other genre. Following the religious doesn't necessarily answer all the questions. And it's called Doubt. And if you need a copy, come and get it. John and Diane are going to borrow this one today, but they'll bring it back to us. And we who like to think that we have the answers to all of humankind's issues are often the ones that are realizing that we bring the greatest fear and doubt into the world. So enjoy watching that. Thank you for your discussion today. Thank you for trying to solve all the issues, at least.
Yeah.
A quick question to Randy.
Yes.
Do you know if Tutti Bene is still in business?
If tutto bene, yes, it certainly is.
Oh, good. Have something for me. I miss it.
It's our local Italian restaurant.